Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. You can't tell, I'm currently in London, and I got 3 album reviews on the docket, so let's start with something a little bit more classically inspired, shall we?
Still here, still grinding, hustling and striving. In these dark times, these dark minds, I'm a diamond. Big Ben is still chiming. They don't want to see us smiling. They want to keep us grimy, but my politics still lively. Still here amongst the sirens. Thunderclaps and violence down Dustin Lane, I'm scribing. No visits from your highness.
Okay, actually we're going to do something that's a little bit more contemporary this time around, and actually from the UK in this regard, because Sons of Kemet, they're an experimental group pulling upon a lot of Africanized jazz, a lot of really experimental organic percussion lines, and some really rich horn sections. I've gone back to a couple of the previous work, and I have had issues with them in the past, but considering they were embracing more elements of black women in their culture in order to talk about it on this record, I was looking to be pretty enthused about where this could possibly be going. And you know what, it's really good, but I struggle to call it as great as so many other critics do, and it's a little tough to pin down why. Yeah, you're still getting a lot of the similar elements. You get the more detailed Africanized percussion, you get the more intricate jazz-inspired horn sections, you even get some vocal sections coming in from grime artists, and it's political to be sure, and I definitely appreciate the direction in which they're going, but I gotta be honest, a lot of this record, it's very hard for me not to have it slide into the background a little bit, particularly during the mid-section where it slows down and it's not as aggressive or progressive in that particular vein. Some of the percussion also kind of throws me. I wish the fidelities of the percussion better matched with the horn lines, and ultimately, while I'm on that note of nitpicking, I really do wish there were more firmer bass grooves in order to drive a lot of these songs, because the progressions are solid, but they could be going in more interesting directions. And finally, when we do have vocal elements, I do appreciate the more political angles that are taken on a couple of the songs near the very beginning and very end, but given that all of these songs were named in some way after black women, you'd think they'd actually get some black women as vocalists on the album or make more direct reference to them on the songs, and I just feel that was a missed opportunity, especially considering some of the songs already do kind of run long as they are. But still, as much as I'm complaining here, I do actually like this record. I like how progressive it feels. A lot of the grooves and melodic lines and a lot of the melodic interplay is really infectious. And overall, in terms of a sound, it's something I can get behind. So yeah, solid 7 out of 10. I know I'm not as high on it as some other critics, but definitely check this out. It's worth it. Yes, I am going to shoot this review in front of Buckingham Palace. And you know, I think it's kind of fitting because of how much of a try-hard this album kind of feels like to me. Honestly, the first couple times I was going through this more drum and bass styled record, I was a little bit at a loss how to properly describe it. It reminded me a little bit of some of Laserbeak's production crossed with the German producer Object, who put out a record, Flatland, back in 2014 that I actually really liked. It's got this weird brittle quality, but then with all the specific vocal overdubs that comes across as a little bit overstated, and honestly some of the lyrics feel a little try-hard, trying to be a little bit too edgy. These flat rubbery walls of bass and slightly more gritty experimental sides of percussion. I wouldn't call it that crazy per se, and if anything, that's one of my big problems with this project. It doesn't push boundaries in the way it should. It goes for a slightly slower tempo, sure, trying to emphasize some of that rubbery heaviness, but at the same time it's not really as catchy as it should be in order to fit in that lane, but the content feels like it should be in that lane, which is weird. And when you consider that a fair number of the songs end with this weird sense of anti-climax that they should have hit a much stronger crescendo than they did, I'm just a little underwhelmed by this. I've heard these sounds done slightly better, even if I'm not quite as familiar with this explosive combination. And again, drum and bass isn't really my thing. Still though, I can see this having an audience, so strong 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. Okay, fine, let's get to the more classically inspired review, shall we? So, Here's the funny thing. A lot of people have taken Vivaldi's Four Seasons and have reinterpreted or deconstructed it over the course of decades. Even if you're not familiar with classical music, you're probably familiar with some of the musical motifs in Vivaldi's work. And as such, when I saw that Meredith was going to be doing so, look, I loved Varmints. Varmints was one of my favorite records of 2016, but one of the reasons I loved it so much was her method of classical composition, taking traditional chord structures and bending them or juxtaposing them in weird and interesting ways opposite particularly oblique time signatures. So having her take a more classical piece, I was intrigued what she was going to do with it, but I wasn't really sure if it made a lot of sense. It's almost like Joss Whedon doing Shakespeare. And then he did that. And yet, even going through this particular piece of her reinterpretation of the Four Seasons, there are some places where she's just going through with the Scottish Ensemble, just playing Vivaldi. Pretty much straightforward in terms of very classical interpretation. And yes, it's played extremely well. It sounds great, but at the same time, what does it really add to the particular picture? It's only when you get some pieces where she adds some of her more traditional electronic elements or starts slightly bending the sounds around where we do get a more traditional Anno Meredith album. And yet, it almost seems like she is toying with some of Vivaldi's sounds rather than explicitly deconstructing them or taking them in a new and interesting place, kind of tickling with the edges rather than making something that's wholly new and unique. Now, that's not always the case. There's a couple pieces in the midsection that is specifically her interpretations that sound superb, but at the same time, it's often a little bit too little. I honestly wish that she had done something that was a little bit more original and not just stuck with a reinterpretation or brushing against a famous classical composer's piece, because honestly, I think she's a much more interesting original composer than she is someone to reinterpret or curate this style of classical music. But again, she's a fan. I get why this was made, but it's one of those projects where it feels like a side venture, something that she ventured off to handle on the side because she is more of a classical composer before she goes back to more original work, and I hope she does. And again, this has extremely niche appeal, and even by that standard, I don't think quite all the electronic elements are quite as integrated as well as they were on Varmints. Granted, there's no vocals this time around, so you don't need to complain about that, but there are some places where the electronic elements feel a shade off-key, or they don't quite mesh in as well as they probably could, or in some cases the metaphors can feel a little bit on the nose with the electronic effects that she integrates. But beyond that, it's still enjoyable. I liked it, so light 7 out of 10. If you're in the audience who might like this, go ahead, check it out.